Have you ever wondered why villains exist? They're not born evil, they're made. Villains are the product of a world that often turns a blind eye to suffering, a world that actively participates in creating the very monsters it fears. They are sculpted by betrayal, forged in the fires of pain, and ultimately defined by the choices of others. Think about it. How many villains started out with noble intentions, only to be twisted and broken by circumstance? How many were driven to darkness by the indifference of those who could have helped? Villains are not simply embodiments of evil, they are reflections of our own societal failings. They hold up a mirror to the darkness we deny, the flaws we refuse to acknowledge. They are the consequences of our collective apathy. Consider the classic tale of a hero betrayed. A character wronged, abandoned, and left to fester in their solitude. This is the breeding ground for villainy. It's in the quiet moments of despair, in the crushing weight of injustice, that the seeds of darkness take root. The world often sees only the monster, the destructive force, but it rarely acknowledges the pain that fueled its creation. We are quick to condemn, but slow to understand. We demand retribution, but offer little in the way of redemption. And so, the villain endures, a constant reminder of our own culpability. They become eternal symbols of fear and blame, conveniently absorbing the sins of a society unwilling to confront its own demons. But what if we dared to look deeper? What if we dared to examine the circumstances that led to their downfall? What if we dared to acknowledge our own role in their creation? Perhaps then we could begin to break the cycle, to prevent the birth of future villains. Perhaps then we could create a world where compassion triumphs over indifference, where understanding replaces judgment, and where even the most broken souls can find a path to redemption. The creation of a villain is a complex process, a confluence of factors that often begins with a single act of betrayal. This betrayal can take many forms: the abandonment of a loved one, the denial of justice, or the systematic oppression of an entire group. Whatever the cause, the effect is the same: a deep wound that festers and festers, poisoning the soul. Imagine a child, full of hope and innocence, who is repeatedly abused and neglected. This child learns that the world is a cruel and unforgiving place, that trust is a dangerous illusion, and that love is a commodity to be earned, not freely given. As they grow older, this child may develop a hardened exterior, a protective shell designed to shield them from further pain. But beneath this shell, the wound remains, festering and growing, until it eventually consumes them. This is how villains are born, not in a single moment of malice, but in a slow and agonizing process of erosion. They are the product of a world that has failed them, a world that has denied them the basic necessities of human connection and compassion. And yet, we are quick to condemn them for their actions, to label them as monsters, without ever acknowledging the pain that drove them to such extremes. We demand that they pay for their crimes, but we offer them no path to redemption. We lock them away, out of sight and out of mind, conveniently forgetting that we played a role in their creation. The villain is a scapegoat, a convenient receptacle for our own collective guilt. They allow us to distance ourselves from the darkness within, to pretend that we are somehow immune to the forces that shape them. But the truth is, we are all capable of villainy. We all have the potential to be driven to extremes by circumstance, to be consumed by anger and resentment, to lash out at the world in a desperate attempt to alleviate our pain. The difference between us and the villain is often simply a matter of degree. We may have been spared the worst traumas, the most devastating betrayals, but we are all vulnerable to the forces that can corrupt and destroy. And so, it is our responsibility to be vigilant, to to be aware of the potential for darkness within ourselves and within the world around us. We must strive to create a society that is more compassionate, more just, and more understanding. We must offer support to those who are struggling, to those who are at risk of falling into the abyss. We must remember that even the most broken souls are capable of redemption, that even the most hardened hearts can be softened by kindness. The creation of a villain is a tragedy, a failure of society to protect its most vulnerable members. But it is also an opportunity for growth, a chance to learn from our mistakes and to create a better world for all. Let us not shy away from the darkness, but confront it with courage and compassion. Let us not condemn the villain, but seek to understand them. Let us not perpetuate the cycle of violence and despair, but break it with acts of kindness and forgiveness. The world needs fewer villains and more heroes. But perhaps the first step in creating more heroes is to understand the origins of villainy. Villains often arise from a place of profound isolation. They are individuals who have been marginalized, ostracized, and left to fend for themselves in a world that seems to have no place for them. This isolation can be both physical and emotional. They may be physically separated from society, living in poverty, in exile, or in some other form of confinement. Or they may be surrounded by people, but still feel utterly alone, unable to connect with others on a meaningful level. This emotional isolation can be just as devastating as physical isolation, if not more so. It can lead to feelings of hopelessness, despair, and a sense that life has no meaning. When individuals are isolated in this way, they are more vulnerable to the forces that can lead to villainy. They may feel that they have nothing to lose, that no one cares about them, and that the world is against them. This can lead to a sense of resentment and anger, which can eventually boil over into violence and destruction. Think of the bullied child who is constantly tormented by their peers. This child may feel isolated and alone, unable to turn to anyone for help. They may develop a deep sense of resentment towards their tormentors and a desire for revenge. If this resentment is allowed to fester, it can eventually consume them, turning them into a villain. Or consider the individual who is discriminated against because of their race, religion, or sexual orientation. This individual may feel marginalized and ostracized, unable to participate fully in society. They may develop a sense of anger and frustration, which can eventually lead to acts of defiance and rebellion. In some cases, this rebellion may take the form of violence, turning them into a villain in the eyes of the dominant culture. Isolation is a breeding ground for villainy. It creates the conditions in which resentment, anger, and despair can flourish. It deprives individuals of the human connection and support that they need to thrive. And it makes them more vulnerable to the forces that can corrupt and destroy. If we want to prevent the creation of villains, we must address the problem of isolation. We must create a society in which everyone feels valued, respected, and connected. We must reach out to those who are struggling and offer them the support that they need. We must build bridges instead of walls and foster a sense of community and belonging. Only then can we hope to break the cycle of isolation and prevent the birth of future villains. The choices of others play a crucial role in the making of a villain. It's not just about individual circumstances or personal failings. It's about how society responds to those who are vulnerable and hurting. Indifference, neglect, and outright cruelty can all contribute to the transformation of an ordinary person into a villain. Consider a scenario where someone is wrongly accused of a crime. The evidence is circumstantial, but public opinion is swayed by prejudice and fear. Instead of a fair trial, they face a rush to judgment, fueled by media sensationalism and political opportunism. Their pleas of innocence are ignored, their reputation is destroyed, and they are ultimately convicted and imprisoned. In this situation, the choices of others, the police, the prosecutors, the judge, the jury, and the media, all contribute to the creation of a villain. An innocent person is unjustly punished, their life is ruined, and they are left with nothing but bitterness and resentment. This resentment can fester and grow, turning them into someone who seeks revenge against the system that wronged them. Or think about a child who is raised in poverty and neglect. Their parents are struggling to make ends meet, and they are unable to provide the child with the basic necessities of life. The child is constantly hungry, cold, and afraid. They are surrounded by violence and crime. They have no access to education or health care. In this situation, the choices of others, the government, the community, and even the parents themselves, all contribute to the creation of a villain. The child is deprived of the opportunities they need to succeed, and they are forced to resort to desperate measures to survive. They may turn to crime, violence, or drug dealing. They may become hardened and cynical, losing all hope for a better future. The choices of others can have a profound impact on the trajectory of a person's life. They can determine whether someone becomes a productive member of society or a villain who seeks to destroy it. We must be mindful of the power that we have to shape the lives of others. We must choose to be compassionate, understanding, and supportive. We must stand up for justice and equality. We must create a society in which everyone has the opportunity to thrive. Only then can we hope to prevent the creation of villains and build a better world for all. Villains often serve as a distorted mirror, reflecting back to society its own hidden flaws and uncomfortable truths. They embody the very aspects of ourselves that we try to deny or suppress. They are the embodiment of our fears, our prejudices, and our collective guilt. By understanding the villain, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and the society in which we live. Consider the villain who is motivated by greed and power. This villain reflects our own society's obsession with wealth and status. We live in a world where success is often measured by material possessions and social standing. We are constantly bombarded with messages that tell us to strive for more, to accumulate more, and to achieve more. The villain who is driven by greed and power simply takes this societal obsession to its extreme. They are willing to do anything to get what they want, even if it means hurting others. By confronting this villain, we are forced to confront our own materialistic tendencies. We are forced to ask ourselves whether we are truly happy with our lives, or whether we are simply chasing after empty promises. Or think about the villain who is motivated by revenge. This villain reflects our own society's tendency towards violence and retribution. We live in a world where violence is often seen as the answer to problems. We glorify violence in our movies, our video games, and our news reports. We are quick to condemn those who commit acts of violence, but we are slow to address the root causes of violence. The villain who is driven by revenge simply takes this societal tendency to its extreme. They are willing to inflict pain and suffering on others in order to avenge the wrongs that have been done to them. By confronting this villain, we are forced to confront our own violent impulses. We are forced to ask ourselves whether violence is ever truly justified, or whether it simply perpetuates a cycle of pain and suffering. Villains are not simply monsters who exist outside of society. They are products of society, and they reflect back to us our own flaws and contradictions. By understanding the villain, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and the society in which we live. We can identify the aspects of our society that contribute to the creation of villains, and we can work to change them. We can create a society that is more just, more compassionate, and more understanding. A society that is less likely to produce villains in the first place. Despite being universally hated and feared, villains possess a strange and enduring appeal. They capture our imaginations, challenge our moral compass, and force us to confront the darker aspects of human nature. This fascination with villains stems from several factors. First, villains often possess a charisma and intelligence that is lacking in many heroes. They are not simply good guys who do the right thing. They are complex and multifaceted characters with their own motivations and desires. They are often more interesting and engaging than the heroes who oppose them. Second, villains often represent a form of rebellion against the status quo. They challenge the established order, question authority, and expose the hypocrisy of those in power. This can be appealing to those who feel marginalized, oppressed, or disenfranchised. Villains offer a vicarious outlet for their anger and frustration. Third, villains often embody our own forbidden desires and impulses. They do the things that we would never dare to do, but that we secretly long to do. They break the rules, defy expectations, and indulge in their darkest fantasies. This can be both terrifying and exhilarating. We are drawn to villains because they represent a part of ourselves that we try to keep hidden. Fourth, villains often provide a sense of catharsis. By watching them suffer and ultimately fail, we are able to release our own pent-up emotions. We can experience a sense of relief and satisfaction knowing that evil has been punished and that good has prevailed. This is why villains are so often used in storytelling. They provide a necessary counterpoint to the hero, and they help to drive the plot forward. They challenge the hero to overcome obstacles, to confront their own weaknesses, and to ultimately triumph over evil. Without villains, stories would be bland and predictable. Villains are essential to the human experience. They remind us of the darkness that exists within ourselves and within the world around us. They challenge us to confront our own moral failings. They force us to question our assumptions about good and evil. And they ultimately help us to appreciate the importance of compassion, understanding, and forgiveness. Villains endure because they are a reflection of ourselves. They are a reminder that even the most seemingly righteous individuals are capable of darkness. They serve as a warning, urging us to remain vigilant against the forces that can corrupt and destroy. Villains are not simply monsters to be feared. They are complex and multifaceted characters who deserve our understanding and attention. By studying them, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us. Villains become eternal symbols of fear and blame, conveniently absorbing the sins of a society unwilling to confront its own demons. This is a powerful and dangerous dynamic. It allows us to distance ourselves from the darkness that exists within ourselves and within our society. It allows us to pretend that we are somehow immune to the forces that can corrupt and destroy. It allows us to avoid taking responsibility for our own actions and for the consequences of those actions. When we scapegoat villains, we are essentially saying that they are the problem and that we are not. We are saying that they are the ones who are responsible for all the evil in the world and that we are innocent. This is a convenient and comforting illusion, but it is also a dangerous one. It prevents us from seeing the ways in which we contribute to the creation of villains. It prevents us from addressing the root causes of evil. It prevents us from creating a more just and compassionate society. We must resist the temptation to scapegoat villains. We must instead strive to understand them. We must examine the circumstances that led to their downfall. We must acknowledge our own role in their creation. Only then can we hope to break the cycle of violence and despair. Only then can we hope to create a world where villains are no longer necessary. The villain is a mirror reflecting society's shadows. They embody the darkness we ignore, the injustices we perpetuate, and the fears we refuse to confront. Their existence is a consequence of our collective choices, a stark reminder of the potential for evil that lurks within us all. But what if we dared to change the narrative? What if we chose to confront the shadows, to dismantle the systems of injustice, and to embrace compassion and understanding? What if we recognize that villains are not born but made, and that we have the power to prevent their creation? Imagine a world where empathy triumphs over apathy, where justice prevails over prejudice, and where every individual is valued and respected. In such a world, the breeding ground for villainy would cease to exist. The seeds of darkness would wither and die, replaced by the blossoming of hope and the promise of a brighter future. This is not a utopian fantasy, but a possibility within our reach. It requires a conscious effort to challenge our own biases, to question the status quo, and to actively work towards creating a more equitable and just society. It demands that we confront the uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our world, and that we commit to making real and lasting change. The choice is ours. We can continue to perpetuate the cycle of villainy by ignoring the shadows and blaming the monsters. Or we can choose to embrace the light, to confront the darkness, and to create a world where villains are no longer necessary. The path to a better future begins with understanding the origins of villainy and with recognizing our own role in shaping the world around us. Let us choose to be architects of hope, builders of justice, and champions of compassion. Let us create a world where the shadows fade and where the light shines brightly for all. The cycle of villain creation can only be broken through conscious effort and societal change. It requires a fundamental shift in our thinking, from blaming individuals to addressing the systemic issues that contribute to their downfall. This shift begins with empathy. We must strive to understand the experiences of those who are marginalized, oppressed, and vulnerable. We must listen to their stories, acknowledge their pain, and recognize their humanity. We must challenge our own biases and prejudices and work to dismantle the systems that perpetuate inequality. This requires a commitment to justice. We must advocate for fair and equitable laws, policies, and practices. We must hold those in power accountable for their actions. We must ensure that everyone has access to the resources and opportunities they need to thrive. This requires a culture of compassion. We must create a society where kindness, understanding, and forgiveness are valued and encouraged. We must support those who are struggling and offer them the help they need to overcome their challenges. We must foster a sense of community and belonging where everyone feels valued and respected. Breaking the cycle of villain creation is not easy. It requires a long-term commitment to change and a willingness to challenge the status quo. But it is essential if we want to create a more just and compassionate world. We must remember that villains are not simply monsters who exist outside of society. They are products of society, and the line between hero and villain is often blurred, a shifting boundary defined by perspective and circumstance. What one person sees as an act of salvation, another experiences as utter devastation. We are quick to label, to categorize, to assign roles of good and evil, but the truth is rarely so simple. Every action, no matter how noble its intent, carries the potential for unintended consequences, for the creation of pain and suffering. And it is in the wake of this pain that the seeds of villainy are often sown. Consider the individual who, driven by a deep-seated sense of injustice, takes matters into their own hands. Perhaps they witness a wrong that goes unpunished, a system that fails to protect the vulnerable. Their heart aches with empathy, their mind burns with righteous anger. They see themselves as a force for good, a champion of the downtrodden. But in their pursuit of justice, they may cross lines, break laws, inflict harm. Their methods, though born of noble intentions, become increasingly questionable, their actions increasingly destructive. To those who stand in their way, they are no longer a hero but a menace, a threat to the established order. They are labeled a villain, their motives questioned, their actions condemned. Or consider the person who is betrayed, abandoned, or abused. Their trust is shattered, their innocence stolen. They are left with scars that run deep, wounds that never fully heal. They may try to move on to rebuild their lives, but the pain lingers, a constant reminder of the injustice they have suffered. Over time, this pain can fester, turning into bitterness, resentment, and a desire for revenge. They may seek to inflict upon others the same suffering they have endured, to make the world pay for the wrongs that have been committed against them. They become consumed by darkness, their hearts hardened, their souls twisted. They are transformed into the very thing they once despised, a villain. The creation of a villain is not always a conscious choice. It is often a gradual process, a slow descent into darkness fueled by a combination of external forces and internal vulnerabilities. It is a story of broken promises, shattered dreams, and unfulfilled potential. It is a tragedy that could have been avoided, a path that could have been diverted. But once the descent begins, it can be difficult to stop. The weight of past wrongs, the lure of power, the intoxicating taste of revenge can all conspire to keep the individual on their destructive course. And what of the society that creates these villains? Are we not all complicit in their creation? Do we not turn a blind eye to injustice, tolerate inequality, and perpetuate systems that breed resentment and despair? Do we not celebrate violence in our entertainment, glorify power in our politics, and reward selfishness in our economy? Are we not all, in some small way, responsible for the darkness that festers in the hearts of those who become villains? Perhaps the most insidious aspect of villainy is its ability to justify itself. The villain often believes that their actions are necessary, that they are serving a greater good, that the ends justify the means. They may see themselves as a martyr, a sacrifice, a necessary evil. They may convince themselves that they are the only ones who can see the truth, that the rest of the world is blind or foolish. This self-deception allows them to commit acts of cruelty and violence without remorse, to rationalize their behavior as a form of justice or self-defense. The villain's perspective is often distorted, their worldview skewed by trauma, anger, and resentment. They may see enemies where there are none, threats where there are only misunderstandings. They may interpret every act of kindness as a manipulation, every gesture of goodwill as a deception. Their paranoia can become all-consuming, leading them to isolate themselves from others, to trust no one, to see the world as a hostile and dangerous place. But even in the darkest of villains, there is often a flicker of humanity, a spark of hope that refuses to be extinguished. There may be moments of doubt, moments of regret, moments of longing for a different path. These moments are often fleeting, quickly suppressed by the weight of past wrongs and the fear of vulnerability. But they are there nonetheless, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The challenge, then, is to find a way to reach these villains, to connect with their humanity, to offer them a path to redemption. This is not an easy task. It requires empathy, patience, and a willingness to see beyond the surface. It requires us to confront our own biases, to challenge our own assumptions, and to recognize the shared humanity that binds us all. It also requires us to acknowledge the role that society plays in the creation of villains. We must address the root causes of injustice, inequality, and despair. We must create systems that are fair, equitable, and compassionate. We must foster a culture of empathy, understanding, and forgiveness. Ultimately, the fight against villainy is a fight for the soul of humanity. It is a struggle between light and darkness, between hope and despair, between love